Bienvenidas, welcome everyone. Gracias por venir a tiempo. Thank you for being here on time. As usual, we're going to give ourselves another 3 minutes. Lucho, thank you for keeping on the song. That was beautiful. Just while maximum at 5 past, we will start. Máximo dentro de 3 minutos, a las 4:05, empezamos. Vamos a darnos unos minutos para que las personas vayan llegando. Bienvenidas, welcome. Once again, thank you for being here on time. We are going to get started now that it's 5 past the hour, and I'm sure you're all eager to get started. Vamos a empezar ya que ya pasaron 5 minutos. Como saben, la traducción está disponible aquí abajito. Pueden elegir su canal para los que están en Zoom. Yo voy a proseguir en inglés. Hoy vamos a tener esta conversación en inglés. So today we are going to have this conversation in English. Whenever you need a translation, as you know, you just click on your translation button below. Welcome again. And for those of you I haven't seen, Happy New Year. This is a very special moment. We are in our very last closing conversation for the Weaving Pluriverse program. And in addition to being the closing of one of the many cycles that we have interwoven together in our program, I would dare say this is a very sacred moment. And so I would like to start by honoring that we are here gathered around an invisible web of relations that brings together very, very special people. And I want to give a warm welcome to you, Josh. Thank you for being here. Josh is our guest today. And many of you probably already know Josh from his voice because he's one of our most favorite podcast hosts. Josh is a founder of the Emerald podcast and the host of the same podcast. But beyond that, Josh is a brilliant myth teller, studier of myths of around the world. He's a teacher, and really, I think for me, one of the most inspiring voices I hear on podcasts. Thank you for being here, Josh. I want to also recognize that we have friends in common, and that's beautiful. We are connected through amazingness, like the synchronicity of life. And yeah, I learned recently that we have very dear friends in common, and that's
Mhm.
also wonderful. Thank you for being here, Josh, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here and looking forward to the conversation. And yeah, great to be in this group.
Thank you, Josh. So yeah, we, as usual, well, first of all, thank you for your time. As I have told you, but also for those of you who are listening to us today and haven't heard before this series, this is the last of the conversations we have of the Weaving Pluriverse program. The Weaving Pluriverse is one of Mundo Comun's interspecies activations that has gathered storytellers, journalists, writers of all practices, audiovisual and graphic practitioners, artists who are interested in sharing the weaving of navigating this moment of our planet through narratives of care and interdependence. That is at the core of what we do, and I think that was at the core of the invitation. Many of the Weaving Pluriverse program participants are here. Many of them will hear us afterwards through the recording. And I think for all of us, it's truly a joy to share this talk with you. And because that's the first thing that I want to start us off with is the art of weaving. We've been really inspired by the wisdom of spiders.
Mhm.
Um, you might remember the myth of Anansi, the spider that invented all alphabets and languages. It's one of my favorite ones. In Weaving Pluriverse, we've spoken a lot about spiders, and we've woven physically and also metaphorically. And so the first place I would like to start with is the spider web. Um, the I think one of the most beautiful analogies that we've been carrying with us is the one of stories being like spider webs. Both spider webs are woven in such a way that they're both a home for the spider, but they're also a trap for others. So stories can also have that quality. They can be both homes and traps. And so, and also the spiders, they weave from the center out, right? And the first, let's say, thread, and I'm going to be just throwing threads, Josh, and you can just navigate as you will. You can wander around the web that we will weave, and we will do that for the first maybe hour or so. Then we'll have a short pause, or maybe not. Let's see, and then we'll open up the conversation for all of us to interact. Um, so the first thread is, yeah, what do you think the spider web, let's say the mythic, archetypical spider is weaving around? What's that center? Where does it lie in this moment of great unraveling? Where is she where is she spiraling around in this current present web of story and power and relationality that we are living right now? And you can take this thread as a provocation to start, and then we'll go.
Yeah, thanks for that provocation. So, taking a moment to feel some gratitude for the weavers and the nets and the webs and the patterns. And I'm pretty deep into a study on pattern right now as it relates to an episode that I'm doing. And so this reminds me of, you know, story as pattern and what's the center of the story and what pattern is being woven with a particular story and um, you know, where is it taking us and ultimately what does it lead to? And spider webs are fractal patterns that emanate from centers, and there is something indeed that lives at the center of that spider web. Um, and that's important, right? It's important that our visions of the pattern of nature and the pattern of creation and the pattern of our lives and the pattern of our interaction have some type of anchor to it, some type of center to it, that it spiral from somewhere and return to somewhere. And you can see in the stories that modernity spins that um, there is a proliferation, a vast web of stories, and often very little inquiry into what actually is the center of that story and where is it taking us and where does it lead us, if you feel what I mean. So there's a story right at the heart of modernity, for example, that says that you too can have unlimited stuff on a planet of limited resources, right? There's that story of modernity. People familiar with that story of modernity, right? The story of advertising, the story of, the purpose of existence is to accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. Well, if we imagine that story as a great entangling web, to what place at the center is that story leading us, right? Like, where is that story ultimately leading us? So it's important as we construct webs of worldview and pattern in our practices and our lives, it's important to deeply inquire what lives right at the center. Is this enhancing our understanding, our embodied understanding, our lived understanding of, what is the center of the world and what is the center of our communal experience? Or is it detracting away from that? Is it taking us, I think of it's no coincidence that the World Wide Web is called the World Wide Web, right? The internet is called the World Wide Web. It is a web. It is indeed a web. And it's very much worth asking as we get entangled in its sticky threads. Um, oh, where is this particular web taking me? Where is it ultimately taking me? You know, consciousness seeks a center. Consciousness seeks what you could call a union point, right? So the web, the internet, works on consciousness and draws it in the same way a spider might attract its prey, right? And it's worth understanding, you know, what are the what are the motivations of those who are programming this web, and where is this web, this story, this ideology that I'm getting kind of sucked into or drawn into, where is it ultimately going to lead? Where is it going to take me? So we can think of myths as webs, stories as webs that are culturally enacted. And there are many modern stories that we enact every day. And, in the face of this, some might say, well, shouldn't we just get rid of the web altogether? Shouldn't we get rid of worldview? Shouldn't we get rid of pattern? Shouldn't we see beyond the stories that are told to us? Shouldn't we see beyond this? And many understandings that I know of will tell you that you don't get beyond the web. What you do is reweave and reweave and reweave and reweave. Right? You feel what I mean? So there's always a pattern, there's always a worldview. We're always forwarding some type of vision of life. There's not like an empty center where there's, just nothing happening and we've found our way to that magical place beyond influence and beyond story. Our lives are an intersection of weavings. And in this intersection of weavings, understanding that, you know, like the stories I tell my kids, the stories that they see, how they see me living my life, right? This forms part of the embodied web of their experience. This forms their pattern. This forms their worldview. How are we weaving? How are we shaping? What stories are we telling? What lives right at the center of those stories? And that can also start to give us just a much more acute awareness of the fact that everything is story. Everything is a web of story. Everything we encounter is a web of story. A person's patterns, their histories, their, traumas, like what they're bringing to their lives, this is a web of story. A person is a walking, shifting, serpentine, spider web like, you know, amassment of patterns. I'm hoping I'm not making it hard for the translators with some of the words I'm using, but amassment of patterns, right? And um, understanding that, understanding energetic pattern, understanding that everything is pattern, that everything is weaving, that everything is web, is important to navigating. Because then we can start to discern, you know, and not everyone likes to speak about it in such binary terms, but Tyson Yunkaporta wrote a book called Right Story, Wrong Story. I don't know if people are familiar with this book, um, which is about discerning, what are the stories that really stand up to the test of time and the test of nature and you know, have some sustainability to them and have some walking power to them. And what are the stories that evaporate quickly because they have no lasting power? The story that I mentioned, the story that, on a planet of limited resources, we can just continue to seek as much stuff as possible. That story won't have much lasting power. It's lasted a little while, but it can't last that long, right? Because the actual architecture of the pattern, the actual architecture of the web of nature dictates that that story will not last, right? It doesn't have legs. Does that make sense? It doesn't have legs. Yeah. There are
It's not very
stories.
sticky. Mm.
What's that? It's not very
It's not a
sticky.
sticky, yeah. Well, it
Yeah.
feels
Well, it's
sticky.
sticky.
Yeah.
It's
It
sticky
feels
in the
very
sense
sticky.
that it's appealing to certain aspects of the human consciousness, but it doesn't have staying power. There's a lot of stories being spun on the World Wide Web these days that don't have staying power, right? There's a lot of ideologies that seem really appealing to people because it satisfies some short-term addictive impulse, but the question is, are those stories sustainable over time? Is like fascism, the story of fascism sustainable over time? Is the story of endless consumption sustainable over time? Yeah. Is the story like, oh, the problem is those others over there? Yeah, that can work for a little while until you take the lens inward and it's like, oh, well, there's another right there in front of me, and there's another, and I'm another, and it can work for a little while, maybe, but it's not a sustainable story, right? So we
Yeah,
have to look at those. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no, sorry, I'm just gonna pick up a thread there, on one of those stories that is very sticky that you speak about in one of, actually, I think it's your latest published episode,
Mm,
on mythic burdens and cosmic supports. And you talk
mm,
about the unconscious save the world stories. Um, yeah, let's take that thread and weave with it,
mm.
as how is that story presenting itself? How is it being part of the pattern that is currently being laid in this present reality?
Yeah. So, for me, this is a very deep inquiry because first off, I like to make clear that I am very much in favor of doing things. I'm very much in favor of, activism and taking action but I think there is a deep question, and particularly in the Western world, and particularly in um, many, uh, I would say, well, Christian derived traditions and traditions that are derived from worldviews in which kind of the central question is one of salvation. I think there are some very deep questions about the burden of taking on the salvation of the world, the salvation of the cosmos as human beings. That the way that a lot of and when there is this kind of frantic sense that the world is dying and it's completely and totally up to us to save it, and we are the ones who are going to save it, and we're going to put our bodies on the line and save the world and uplift all of the cosmos and this type of thing. Well, you know, that is an activist narrative that bears a lot of close resemblance to many of the religious narratives that it has inherited. And I think that is really deeply worth looking at. And I think it's deeply worth looking at for many reasons. One is, you know, yes, there are things that need to be addressed, and there are systems that need deep reevaluation, and there may be even some systems that need to be toppled altogether. But the question is always, you know, like the architect Buckminster Fuller talked about, and he was someone who was very knowledgeable about pattern and weaving, right? He talked about what does it take to make old systems obsolete? You have to have a vision, a long-term sustainable vision for how you want to live life and how you architect community and how you architect space and interrelationality with the natural world. You can't just come to it with this kind of, you know, climactic vision of saving. You have to come to it with a vision of architecting over time. And the more the narrative is about, like, we've only got 1 year left, and if we don't make these decisions in this year, and if we don't do this in 1 year, the entire planet is going to die. And, well, we've set ourselves an impossible task, first of all, because things take time. Reweaving systems takes time. And yeah, we may see the effects, and we are seeing the effects. And, people in various parts of the world are seeing the effects more and more. Um, like, we may see the effects, the karmic effects of humanity's actions are on full display these days, and of course, within that, we should do something. But what we do, and, um, there are going to be many perspectives on this, but what we do has to be informed by understanding of the overarching patterns of nature and how sustainable systems actually work, and an architecting of systems over time to be in harmony and alignment with that great pattern. There have been countless cases where of, you know, toppling and overthrow. Um, you know, and I don't have to tell people from Latin America this. I mean, there have been countless cases of toppling and overthrow where what came in um, was just as bad or worse as what was toppled. And this is always something that has to be kept in mind and heart. So, like, what is transpiring now on planet Earth, in one way, is something that is urgent and needs to be addressed and needs to be, you know, um, worked through and needs to be repatterned. And there are so many people who are meeting this call to this deep repatterning. But I don't think of it in terms of salvation, saving, the planet, the overarching pattern of nature, the weaving of this tapestry of nature. This planet has gone through 6 extinction events. It has endured and thrived for millions, billions of years. I mean, there are epochs in the Earth's history, which I mentioned in that episode. Mention like periods in the Earth's history where, you know, there was fire and ash for 1 million years, and another period where it rained for 1 million years, right? The Carnian pluvial event, it's called. It rained on planet Earth for 1 million years. So we think in terms of timescales. We reinforce the discourse of the Anthropocene constantly by saying it's all about us and we're the ones who are saving it. And there are larger patterns at play that we might not even be aware of. If you really understand there to be a pattern of nature, then some of what's going on now too is part of that pattern, even as disjointed and chaotic as it seems. You zoom out, we might see a web of a very anxious, very caffeinated spider when we look up close. But if you zoom out the web far enough to look at the pattern, you might see that there are greater patterns at play and there are deeper patterns at play. And that's not, again, and I have to make this clear because the mind immediately goes to like, are you saying do nothing? Or are you saying, of course not? Of course I'm not saying do nothing. Of course there are things that need to be addressed. You're not going to tell a suffering child, like, oh, well, don't you see this is all part of some great larger pattern? Of course not. But when we ourselves and our communities, our artistic communities, our ritual communities, our communities seeking to be sustainable within ecology, when we ourselves have a deeper sense of that larger pattern of nature, then it affects how we address things. It affects the tempo at which we address things. It affects our ability to make longer term decisions for systems that can actually last, And that's where I think we need to get out of the mindset of saving a little bit and a little bit more into the mind and body set of, like you're speaking about, weaving for longer term adaptability and sustainability.
Josh, it's beautiful that you speak about patterns because we were actually talking about it this morning, about rhythm and patterns as really two anchors of our practice. But we can get into that later. I wanted to pick up on one of the things that I'm going to sort of weave with one of the first things you said, and it's that there's this, when you are reweaving the patterns that constitute our realities or our pluriverse, the most important act is discernment. And it feels disturbing at the moment, in this very fast forward, emerging new pattern that almost like takes us with it, in terms of the technologies that we are currently seeing evolve. You also have a beautiful episode called on mythic powers in the age. What was it? Mythic powers. So you want to be a sorcerer in the age of mythic powers.
Yeah.
The AI episode. It's you can see I'm a true fan, and I wanted you to weave in the conversation this act of discernment, the bothering or sometimes strangeness of feeling this emergence of a new pattern that it feels we don't, it's not just that we don't control, it's that like it's like a self-creating pattern a little bit beyond our own patterning, right? That feels like is emerging. How do we cultivate discernment in a time where, and this is one of the things that in the Weaving Pluriverse program we've been exploring, it's this idea that fiction and nonfiction used to be a dichotomic divide that is now very quickly eroding.
Mm.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Maybe it has always been a non-dichotomy, yeah? But the way it's eroding right now, there's some restlessness about it because discernment becomes so hard. So there's my thread to you. How do we cultivate discernment?
So, from the Greek traditions, Prometheus, when he was making human beings out of clay, right at the beginning there in his pottery studio, uh, made a beautiful pot, a beautiful vessel, and um, he gave this vessel limbs, and he gave it feet, and it was the most exquisite creation. And he named it Truth. And satisfied with what he had done, he went for a little tea break. And his assistant, who was kind of a trickster type figure, was like, wow, this is an incredibly beautiful pot, beautiful vessel named Truth that my mentor has made here. I'm going to make one just like it. It's going to look exactly the same. Yeah. And so he makes this vessel that's exactly the same, exactly the same, except he doesn't quite finish it. So Prometheus comes back, and there are these two vessels sitting there, and Prometheus sees the vessel that his assistant made, and he said, "Wow, this is incredible. Your artistry is really, I can barely even tell the difference. Let's see, is there any difference between this vessel called Truth and what's the name of this vessel? Well, the name of this vessel is Illusion. Is there any difference at all?" Yeah. Well, it turned out that the assistant hadn't gotten to making the feet yet. So the vessel that Prometheus made could walk. The vessel of truth could walk, right? It had that embodied power of being able to walk, but the vessel of illusion couldn't walk. And I relate that to, you know, what I was speaking about before when we have to look at how stories actually play themselves out within embodied reality. We have to look at how does this actually, like, we can come up with, some kind of philosophy of how human beings should live their lives and all this kind of stuff. Well, the real question is, how does this actually play itself out in bodies? How does it play itself out in bodies over time? So the measure of, discernment is like the knowledge of how this is actually going to play itself out in the body of the community, in the body of the culture, in the body of the ecology, right? The discernment of the pattern that might look so close to that, you know, pattern. And again, that's a story that has a very dichotomous vision of truth and illusion. And in an upcoming episode, I'm going to soften that space a little bit. But what is important is looking at how patterns play themselves out, how stories play themselves out. And that doesn't mean that a story is always going to play itself out in a perfectly neat and tidy way. But it does mean that if a story is, you know, completely abstract and has no embodied element to it, and has never stood the test of actually having to be played out in a cultural tradition, for example, you know, right now, across the world, in particular in the United States, there are 20th century ideologies that, if you look at how they actually played out in the world, played out terribly and didn't really last very long and have no lasting power. So we should be able to discern, right? To have the discernment to say, oh, this is a story that might be immediately appealing, but it doesn't have a lot of lasting power. I think another thing that's really important with this is understanding, as so many traditional systems have over so many thousands of years, understanding that the primary interaction of the human being with the world involves altered states of consciousness. It involves altered states of consciousness. When we open our phone, a primary reason we're doing it is not to like take care of that thing on our to-do list or like, make sure we get everything done or stay in contact. Those are all the kind of theoretical things. What's really appealing about it is that it alters our consciousness. It takes us into another world, right? The more that we understand, when we do ritual, we step into another world. When we pick up our phone, we step into another world. When we sing together, we step into another world. When we dance together, we step into another world. These are all ways that human beings navigate. Like the alteration of consciousness ritually is something that there are very few absolute universals in anthropology, but it is a human universal in every single culture that's ever been studied. That human beings have rituals of some type of consciousness alteration, right? Since we've lost the kind of understanding of that in the modern world, we don't notice when we're being sucked into what can be called an illusory other world, into a really tangled web. We think, oh, I'm doom scrolling for half an hour. I don't know if doom scrolling translates into Spanish, but I'm doom scrolling for half an hour because I really feel like I want to stay on top of what's going on in the world. No, you're doom scrolling for half an hour. It's much deeper than that. It's much more somatic than that. You are getting drawn into an altered state of consciousness and you are following the thread to the center of the spider web. And in this case, the spider at the center is not the beautiful grandmother spider of of so many traditions. The spider at the center wants to devour you, or at least take your attention and your money so they can sell your info to advertisers and this type of thing, right? This is like the nature of discernment. Like, what are our barometers of how to navigate that? I'm doing a whole episode. The next episode I'm doing is on dragon and serpent mythologies, which gets very deep into patterns. And then the one after that is going to be on illusion. And this question of discernment is going to be a very, very central question in that episode. You know, for me, they're part of my barometers for discernment um, have a lot to do with community and the community I surround myself with. So if we have good friends and strong community around us, then we help each other discern. We don't have to be the hero navigator who has to make all those discernments. We help each other discern. We help each other, like, you know, hey, I'm thinking about getting involved in this, real estate scheme that I found on the internet. Then we have a community of friends who says, maybe not. Maybe don't do that. And I mean, it's a silly example, but like, it's an example that holds a lot of weight these days. So to have community of discernment, as opposed to just like, we have to be the sword bearers of discernment, I think is important. Then I tend to look at what a range of traditional systems has said about this particular issue or topic over thousands and thousands of years. It doesn't mean, first of all, that there's not difference in those traditions. There is. There's difference in traditions. But there's also areas of great congruity in traditions. And, if I hear a conspiracy theory that bears no resemblance to how traditional systems have ever understood the world, that I can't find one instance of a traditional system having that, you know, pattern in their cultural foundation, then I have a pretty good sense that that might be something that is, a fabrication of the modern fractured web, right? So, you know, I think this is an incredibly important question for people who are spending a lot more time in the psychedelic space. I think that there are traditional systems in the psychedelic space that spend a lot of time speaking about how to tell the difference between, you know, what you could call like the beneficial medicine patterns and then those patterns that might be emanating from deceptive spirits, right? I think this type of understanding and navigation, first of all, it can only come through time and through practice. But like someone, you know, from Los Angeles goes to Peru and drinks ayahuasca for the first time and just has their mind completely blown open and is flooded with insights and taken down 1,000 different spiraling roads. And their tendency might be either on the one hand to say, oh, well, all of this is a hallucination. And on the other hand might be to say, oh, all of this is completely and totally real, and everything that my inner voice is telling me about myself in this amplified state is true. And I am uniquely special. And in fact, I'm some kind of messianic figure and like all these kind of things, right? There's danger in seeing all of it as a hallucination, because that's not how traditional systems see it. It's part of an evolving pattern, and some of those patterns might be deceptive, and some of them might want to stay totally away from, and some of them you might want to embrace. But I generally find like, those voices that tell me everything I want to hear about myself, right? Like I've done the spiritual seeking and I've figured out that like, I'm great. Like there those are ones that we might want to inquire deeply about. That's where we might want to take that sort of discernment a little bit deeper. Because generally speaking, for deep, what you could call spiritual alchemy to take place, we need to do some type of process of shedding and letting go of those immediate impulsive ego forces. That's like always been part of the process. So um, like a lot of this has to do with the ability to discern what you could call short-term addictive waves, like pulls, versus the bigger picture of the movements and currents of the ocean over time. One of the ways that I talk about discernment in the course that I teach is deeply tied to lunar cycles. And, we tend, when something strikes us, say it's like, an attraction to another person. I bet everyone here has had the experience at some point in their life of having this deep pull of attraction towards another person to the point that it's like you can't even imagine like being without them, And I bet people have also had the experience of that like rebounding and fading like incredibly quickly. And it's like, where did that feeling go? Right? It's like one day, it's like, oh my God, I can't imagine existence without, and it doesn't have to be a person. It can be, anything that's at the center of our longing, right? Our momentary longing. And then see, like with the ebb and flow of the moon, see if that longing persists. See if it persists. Give it time. Give it space, as you'll recognize the current part of the course that that you're in, Isabel, right? Like giving things time and space becomes a very deep vehicle for discernment. A lot of the reason we can't discern these days is because we're in a rush to discern. And we try to do it with our normal waking state of consciousness. And we're not paying attention to the like addictive longings that thing is playing on within us. And, we have to go deeper to like the deeper wants, the deeper longings. What are we really longing for? Is it that immediate internet purchase, or is it a deeper sense of, um, connection to a living, breathing cosmos? Is it that we want to have a vehicle through which, our poems and songs of longing and devotion can find voice over time? What is it we're really longing for? And that can be a barometer of discernment, so that like everything that comes our way is balanced by these deeper lunar cycles. One thing I do as a practice in my life, if I'm feeling a strong pull towards something, like a project or something like that, I give it at least one full lunar cycle and I come back to where the moon was when that pull first arose. I come back a month later and see where I'm at with it now. How does it feel now? How has it shifted? How has it changed? How is it, giving things time and space. Um, Giving things time and space.
Thank you
And
for that, Josh.
yeah,
Yeah,
thank
that's
you. Thank you. I'll just keep rambling unless you,
no, it's okay. Okay, I'm gonna
it's
interrupt
part
you.
of the
You're
spiraling
yes,
web
that's
weaving
it's fine.
communication style.
It's
Uh,
fine. I love that. It's very rare to give ourselves time recently. So I'm just also trying to be spacious with the conversation.
mm,
And as you speak about that ability to discern, what comes to me in interweaving is this idea about what it truly is to hold and pass on power. And I maybe we can go down the thread of power because I do feel that the ability to discern has always been, but more deeply now, is that quality or nurturing that ability or that capacity is what truly um, gives us sovereignty, autonomy, in other terms, power. Power in the when you also have an episode on power called on powers great and small, and it's beautiful how you speak about power being the structure of nature, being mandalas of power, and you actually speak about the term power in Spanish, and you say in Spanish, in español, power, poder means also to be able to, and it's connected. It's like the more and more it's evident that our ability to create is where power resides. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the story of power that is currently being rewoven, and with what are we reweaving it with? what's
Mm.
what what are what's the repatterning in the realm of power that you see emerge at the moment?
Yeah, this is one I don't think I can answer in 5 minutes. But
Take more. You can take as long as you need.
yeah. Um, you know, recently a person in the United States administration, who I will not name, said that um, the real world is governed by force and power, the real world. And I issued a little bit of a response for whatever that's worth. I issued a little response and said, yeah, the real world is governed by force. It's governed by the force of nature. It's governed by the force of time, right? The time in which all this unfolds, time which will reduce empires to dust and then bring them up again out of the sand. And, you know, there are great cycles at play. There is a power. There is a power that continually um, moves and flows through the world. It is the world. It is the everythingness of the cosmos, but it also coalesces and manifests in certain parts of the mandala in more vibrant ways. And everything we see within nature, like a leaf, is designed to receive and hold solar power, right? This is what a leaf is. This is what bodies are. Bodies receive of the power and give back to the power and are expressions of the power. And the cultural traditions that have understood that there is a power that we are part of, but is also vaster than us, right? We are inextricably part of it, and it moves through us, and we can access its infinite nature within us, right? But we don't hold it, we don't own it. You see all these guys now really scrambling to figure out how to hold on to that power forever. How to upload their consciousness so they can live forever. How to, like, all of these kinds of things, which are desperate attempts of human beings to ignore the way the actual power of time and nature works, which is that, we are hollow reeds, we are instruments, and power passes through us. And yes, we need to have like architect our communities and our ritual systems and our creative work so that it receives of that power and rechannels it and distributes it the same way that the phenomenal irrigation systems of pre-Columbian cultures like worked with water redistribution. We need to understand what it means to funnel power and concentrate power, but we are not the power, and it is not something we own, and it is not something we can hoard, right? And this basic understanding is right at the heart of it, you know, and the understanding that the best I can do as a human being is work to align myself and the communal systems I'm part of to that larger power, um, in sustainable ways. Like, this is like the hard understanding for me of what it means to be a human being. This is what, like in Australian Aboriginal traditions, when they speak of the human role as custodial, um, it's a custodial power in which we understand what it means to caretake this place for a while, for a while, and set up systems that can last and set up systems that, if you really start to get into, and I'm just starting to get into this through some conversations I've been fortunate enough to have with Australian Aboriginal elders, but if you really start to get into like their understanding of food systems and their understanding of, the long view of seasonal cycles and all this kind of stuff, it's absolutely profound. And it sets human beings up for a much deeper, much longer, you know, vision of human thriving. So human thriving is built upon receiving, channeling, redistributing that power. And if we fall too deep into thinking that power is just a human construct, we get into this dichotomy which exists a lot in the modern world, which like either it's this human-made thing that is wonderful and glorious and I want it and I want to keep it and I want as much as I can and that kind of, you know, or it needs to be abolished altogether and there's no such thing as power. And, you know, we have to, I feel, be a little bit more deep pattern weavers than that. There's a power to those Shipibo patterns, and the power is in the pattern. The power isn't just like, you know, like if things are completely amorphous, then they don't concentrate and redistribute and hold power in the same way. Everything in nature is structured, right, as a receiver and redistributor of power. And the dynamics of a forest are the dynamics of all of these interlocking architectures, mandalas of power, co creating and co-inhabiting. So power has to be recognized as a reality, and it has to be recognized that it concentrates in certain places and certain times, and even in certain people. There are people who just are imbued with a certain charisma, for example. Well, rather than just saying like, let's get rid of all kind of manifestations or understandings of power whatsoever. Well, how does that then work with charismatic people? You have to have checks and balances around charismatic people. You have to have architectured systems that can manage the flow of power. Again, just like irrigation systems manage the flow of water. It's very, very similar, right? So I don't think in the West sometimes the discussion veers into like structure or structurelessness, right? And I don't think that's a helpful way of looking at it because everything in nature, I'm looking at these beautiful succulents behind Anna Maria there, the like everything in nature is profoundly structured. Everything in nature is profoundly architected, and you have interweavings of architecture, right? So the question becomes not like, to hoard power or to abolish power. The question becomes, how do we provide um, a mandala, an architecture in which that power can thrive and nourish and support all aspects of the mandala as the centers that they are, because every point of the mandala is the center of its own mandala, right? How do we weave? How do we redistribute? How do we architect systems of power that honor that? Um, so yeah, that's a few thoughts. I mean, there's a lot more. And then there's the question of how that actually translates into actual human systems, which I'm going to get into more in upcoming episodes. And it'll be a nice, energized discussions because I think that I'll say a lot of things that people deeply resonate with, and then I may say some things that like cause some feather ruffling too. And that's, part of the difficult when we are faced right now with the way that the global powers are acting, we have to have deeper conversations than just like, topple it all. We have to have deeper conversations than like, you know, yeah. than topple it all. We have to have a lot more thoroughly discussed vision than that.
Absolutely. That's the whole, I think that's the whole ethos behind our work as well. And I'm just curious, Josh, what's one of those feather ruffly ideas that is currently emerging? Give us a spoiler.
Well, for example, if you look at traditional systems, there are many traditional systems that are egalitarian from what you could call like a property distribution standpoint, especially in places where there's not so much to own, right? Um, but that doesn't mean that traditional systems are all what you could call like hierarchy free, right? There actually are spiritual hierarchies that there is gatekeeping around traditional knowledge, and gatekeeping has become thought of as kind of a negative thing. But boundary and gate are actually deeply important to the architecture of individual consciousness, to that discernment process we talked about before. There was knowledge I was exposed to at a certain age that I wasn't ready for. I hadn't done the preliminary work necessary to prepare myself for that. And so it just kind of, at best, it'll just kind of flow off a person like water. And at worst, it can actually do some damage if a person is like exposed to things or doing practices that they're not ready for and this type of thing. You know, there is a value to eldership, and there's a reason why elders sit at kind of, the heart of the decision-making body of a lot of cultural traditions because, you can ask yourself, so to use that example of water systems, say there's a group of elders that have been practicing this particular way of managing water for generations and generations and generations, and then say kind of young trickster upstart comes along and is like, I want to do this totally a different way. And they've never even practiced, they've never even gone through the decades of practice of doing it the old way. Well, should that newcomer upstart have the exact same level of voice in the community as the people who've been doing it for years and years and years? This is a really deep question. Obviously you want a cultural system that is able to refresh and renew. You want the voices of young, enthusiastic people to like shape culture traditions. But you also have to maintain the foundation of eldership, or a cultural tradition and knowledge gets lost. And this is an issue that a lot of indigenous traditions are facing right now. Um, and we have, in the modern progressive world, we have kind of this vision of everything available to everyone all the time, no boundaries. And that may not be a recipe for actually really being able to receive and hold and redistribute that potency that I'm talking about. There's a reason why certain things are built around, no, when you've kind of, shown yourself to be a little bit able to, like I said in the last episode, carry 1 grain of rice for 40 days or 100 days, then maybe we can talk about giving you something else to carry that's a little heavier and show that you can carry that for a little while. And then maybe you'll be, you know, entrusted with something, that's more proportional to where you actually are at energetically. And this relates to like people now, very much taking on world-sized cosmic burdens, taking on you know, like I'm gonna be the one and I gotta be the one. It's well, like, have you gone through some basic initiation steps? Like, can you carry that single grain of rice? Can you even keep your attention focused on one thing for a little while? You know? And so, that's like an aspect of the feather ruffling is like, I think it's important to ask these questions, you know, like, and I mean, this gets into a deep discussion around what decolonizing actually looks like. You know, decolonizing has been kind of framed as like, okay, there's colonial hierarchy, and then decolonizing would be to like take the hierarchy out of the thing entirely. Or there's structure, and decolonizing is opening. And I think it's a lot more intricate than that. Traditional systems, indigenous systems, are architected. They're deeply structured, and um, there are initiatory systems that if you just say like, okay, everything available to everyone all the time in any way, those traditional systems aren't being done justice to either. I don't think you can really call that decolonizing. Um, so yeah, there's a little bit of there's a little bit of the feather ruffling.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that, Josh.
Yeah.
I, yeah, as to use a very modern progressive expression, I deeply resonate
Mm,
with your the way you are framing that, and yeah, I think it- it's for humans in the West who are in all positive good faith wanting to decolonize. It's a challenge to reweave, not from scratch, not from take it away, and to really to come back to this point, discern and remember in a context where we have little reference. Sometimes, obviously, there are hundreds and thousands of traditional cultures, and I'm not deleting that. What I'm saying is that it's not obvious, and you normally don't access them quickly, nor you should, and nor is it that we just need to copy paste and just go back to some sort of idyllic past, because it's
yeah.
also not perfect. So I just find myself deeply resonating with what you said, and also being humbled by the task of going deeper into these questions and what they mean for our bodies, for how
Mhm.
we recreate pattern from the way we connect with our own bodies. And so I want to close out this round by asking you just one more question that has to do with our embodied experience and the
Mm.
fact that in that act of repatterning, the the somatic experience and the narrative experience in the modern world seem to be two different things. But one of the things that where I actually feel we are in sisterhood, brotherhood, siblinghood, is that we've been trying to cultivate a way of being that doesn't separate the two. That actually our way of reweaving and of finding the patterns again has to do with the power, that power of discernment rooted in our body, in our embodied experience. That's the only way to weave a fabric that has legs, as you've mentioned in the past, or
Mm.
that remembers patterns, that when you find out that you've been doing that, it comes out to be very much more similar to the traditions of our own ancestors than we would have thought. So yeah, let's maybe just that one last question from me, and then we will open up for a broader discussion.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what you're speaking of means the deep, breath-filled, ongoing inquiry into what sustainable pattern making really looks like, and the understanding that, we are so used to, in the age of literacy, we are so used to the sequence of events being like you come up with an idea or an ideology and then you see how it works out in the world, right? And, the fact that we've kind of inverted that cycle has caused tremendous amounts of pain in the world. I mean, you think of some of the overarching ideologies or revolutionary ideologies or outdated religious ideologies that have been like, okay, here's the theory on paper. Now let's see how that comes into, practice in body. And if you do it that way, it's a grand experiment. And the experiment doesn't always work out because sometimes, guess what? What a middle class German philosopher imagined as like the ideal utopian society, when you actually try and put it into practice, might not work so well. And are you going to figure that out by having millions of people starve, or are you going to figure that out the other way around, which is how in traditional systems it's much more done over long periods of time. Everything is tested in ceremony. Everything is tested in seasonal cycles. Everything is tested in how does this actually, the feedback mechanisms. Tyson Yunkaporta is so good at talking about this. The feedback mechanisms are immediate, and they're in the land, and they're in our relationship with the land. So it's about designing and building systems that come from our embodied experience of the patterns of nature rather than imagining some system and trying to fit our communities to that system without any inquiry into whether this is actually a reflection of reality or not, or of the reality of nature. So um, I'm thinking about an episode called Sense Making Means Sense Waking, which has to do with, the whole, even like the whole philosophical sense making movement now. It's like the way that we ultimately make sense of what is going on in the world these days is not theoretically, you know, the way that we ultimately are going to make sense of what's going on in the world these days is to have, you could say, embodied or ritual means or ceremonial means or practice means of some kind to actually process. Ritual is like the
Ah,
processing body of a culture. Um, like ritual, and by ritual, I don't just mean, quote unquote religious ritual, artistic ritual. Like ritual is the processing body of a culture. It's where we get to take, everything that's going on in this fractured and crazy world and actually digest, assimilate, embody, and re-express. And, you know, that embodied piece of it has to lead rather than to follow. It can't be that bodies follow the ideology. It has to be that the ideology comes from the pattern of how bodies actually exist within the cosmos. And it sounds simple when you really say it, but you know, there are people with really out there ideologies right now who are getting like millions of followers on social media and stuff like that. And sometimes, um, and no offense to, the younger generation, because I consider myself the younger generation, even though I'm not. But like, sometimes these are like 23, 24, 25-year-old kids who are like, oh, I've got this whole ideology, like, follow me. It's like, well, has that stood the test of actual embodiment? Has that stood the test of like, you know? And yeah, so I'm continually called back to a deep, long, slow inquiry. And by inquiry, I don't mean mental inquiry. I mean felt inquiry into what the establishment of sustainable systems actually means. And it has to be experience first, ideology second, right? And the ideology and the experience should ultimately be one thing rather than two separate things. So those are some thoughts on that. I don't know if that's where you were heading, but
mhm. Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you. I am going to, absolutely, yes. I'm going to ask you, Josh, because you've been the one primarily speaking all this time, if you need a little break
No, no,
or feel like we can go on.
no. I'm
Okay.
used to, I'm used to,
Okay.
I'm used to talking a lot, and
Okay.
and
Okay.
I'd love to hear other voices.
Yes. So
So
I'm
yeah.
just gonna hand over to everybody else on Zoom, whomever would like. I know that Susan, you had a question that you put on the chat. Would you like to say it out loud?
Thank you, Isabel. I'm driving, so that's why I'm. And I apologize, I came late. But Josh, what you're saying about embodied first, and I just spent yesterday with with a whole bunch of Aboriginal folks who, not only what was the culture of the land, but coming through the healing of so much of this. And if people haven't already seen, there's a whole series called The Eternal Song, with different indigenous communities around the world. It's at least for people like me who are walking alongside or trying to learn about people who were just naturally in communion with the land, and then being stripped of that, and then they're reclaiming it. It works, and then I'm one of those mongrel Northern Europeans, but something in my bones and dreams lets me know that there's some indigeneity. But that's my long-winded way to get to the question, which is, I really, as someone who's on the cusp of elderhood, I never know if I'm the oldest young person in the room or the youngest old person in the room. But you talk about the upstarts, but Josh, I think the humans are the upstarts. I really do. And I think we've got these fancy pantsy brains, and you're really great at talking, and I like the way you're working with the concepts. But where do we situate ourselves in that profound humility of being just a little bit careful when we talk about systems and architectures, because it still smacks to me of Ayn Rand and Howard Rourke, and we're going to build the skyscrapers, and aren't we clever? I don't know. I think it's like, what's already grown here? And then take our natural place in that longer term view. So I love going to Peru and seeing what they did with the water. I loved being in the Sacred Valley. And yet there's the older I get, the more I'm like, there is some larger cosmic flow. And how do we, situate ourselves in that and start using the language of confluencing power? I like how you talked about power. In the cosmos, that now, they're talking about basins of attraction. There is so much fluid in the macrocosmo and the micro. And I'm just kind of yearning for some other language than architecture to deal with all this fluid.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for the beautiful question and dynamic wording, and I appreciate the energy behind it. And yeah, I mean, people can use language that resonates with them. Architecting to me does not mean the construction of a skyscraper with a crane. I'm coming much more from the Tibetan tantric visions of the fluid of consciousness being, you could say crystallized and given luminous shape through practice and this type of thing. So I'm not talking about major architectural projects in the urban development sense. I'm talking about the ritual space when human beings gather in a circle. That's an architected space. Like when we gather in a circle, that's an architecture. Nature is brimming with architecture. Water, fluid, those pools that you're talking about, you know, water is a very strong architecture. It's got that particular molecular, triangular, and hexagonal structure that is deeply, deeply strong. So, part of the, I think, issue in the Western world is that we have dichotomous language between that which is rigid and structured and that which flows and is open. And really, when we look at nature, nature challenges that at every turn. That, the spine of the jaguar, which is so strong, is incredibly flexible. And um, that which appears, sturdy within nature also has a huge amount of flow and give. And trees exhibit this incredible foundational strength and also, um, are so sensitive that through the tips of their leaves they eat light. And so all of this in nature is a kind of seamless, harmonious flow. And within that, the humility that you're talking about, like, when I talk about architecting sustainable systems, I mean, what I'm really talking about is reverence for the power of nature and understanding what it means to be aligned to that. And different cultures have had different, you know, Australian Aboriginal cultures are an example of people who were really, you know, really imbued with the philosophy and the worldview and the embodied practice of, you know, we only need to make very few modifications in order for this to really hum well. Traditional systems are interesting in their vision of human beings because human beings, the humility that human beings need as upstarts, as beings with these kind of, you know, jumpy brains. Human beings need to recognize their place within the relational web, and that place is very, very small. And then paradoxically, but not paradoxically really, traditional systems will tell you mythologies in which the place of the human being is actually very special and very central. And, for us to understand that perhaps we are central, and this gets back to that vision of every point of the mandala is a center in its own way. So it's not just that human beings are small and we should get out of the way entirely. I've never encountered a traditional culture that said that that was our role. But it's that, we are part of this interrelational web and we have a particular role. And that role is often described as custodial or ceremonial. It involves singing back. It involves dancing our way back. It involves practices of remembering. And it involves, if you look at how indigenous systems work with forests and work with food production and this type of thing, it involves rigorous involvement with nature that is not hands off. It's not totally hands off. It is a deep, rigorous involvement. But there's a lot of ways to describe that, and architecting is only one way. And if you're called to a different word, by all means, use that different word. For me, the heart of it is the recognition of our humble place in this world of powers and understanding what it means to be in alignment to those greater powers and to serve those greater powers. And part of the way we serve, it's the same as in the balance of love. Part of the way we serve love is by allowing, and part of the way we serve love is by doing. Right? Part of the way we serve love is by being open, and part of the way we serve love is by setting boundary. And these two things go together always. What does it mean for me to love my kids? I grew up with parents who were coming out of the hippie generation, and they kind of thought that the way to serve love was to kind of just let me do whatever I want, and that was love, right? It took me a while to realize that, and they were coming from backgrounds where it was the exact opposite, where it's like restriction, right? Restriction, openness, this dance that we particularly see in the modern world. What I'm trying to learn in the very experimental weaving of being a parent is, when am I called to just let things be? And when am I called to set a boundary or make my imprint? When am I called to let things be? When am I called to, this to me is love. Like what it means to love this planet, what it means to love this cosmos is in this balance of when to say yes and when to say no, when to allow and surrender. And I do a lot of practices of allowing and surrender. It's a deep part of my spiritual practice, and I love surrendering. There's nothing better than just thy will be done, cosmos, right? And then we're also called to establish and set boundary and do sometimes too. And this beautiful balance, I think, is right at the heart of what it means to be a human practicing love. So, but all terminology around how to do that, whether it's terminology of fluids or or architectures, all terminology is welcome because ultimately it is a poetic endeavor. Right. Thank you.
You reminded me of something I learned recently, that the Incas actually called their rock-based architecture. I'm not sure you've probably seen it, Susan, if you've seen the Sacred Valley, and they called it a fluid architecture. And it's massive stones, but they call it fluid architecture. It's beautiful. Thank you for that beautiful question and also answer, Josh. And Marce, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Amazing talk. Thanks. You talked about the importance of altered states. And I wonder, now that we are done scrolling to alter our states, how can we build real and meaningful rituals or experiences that make sense for urban, modern societies that allows us to alter our states and with real connections and presence?
Yeah, I mean, for me, first and foundationally, like recognizing that so much of what human beings do is around consciousness alteration. I mean, I actually did this whole kind of spin-off research investigation for an episode. It never made its way into the episode, but like how much of the global economy is actually geared around consciousness alteration. And there are the obvious things like, the um, alcohol industry and caffeine industry and this type of thing. But then you get into entertainment, you get into video games, you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and you start to understand that consciousness alteration is a human imperative. Like we've got these upstart brains that Susan was talking about. We've got these brains that feel what? Scattered, distant, separate. Mythologies around the world will speak about why this is. Like the human being, very different than, you know, the shama bird or the wild boar. Like the human being feels scattered, separate, distant, and we need to find that experience of flow, that experience of conjunction again. This is why the meditative traditions of the world exist. This is why ecstatic tradition exists. It's really ultimately why religious tradition exists. It is to reconnect us, to alter our consciousness from the kind of tumult of day-to-day existence and reconnect us to a deeper fluid flow, right? So many human activities are geared around this. A book, when you read a book, that is a consciousness alteration. You are suddenly riding this trail, right? How does Roberto Colasso describe it? Like the scripture that was written before the creation of the world in black fire and white fire. You're riding this little trail of black fire across a page of white fire, right? You're like, yeah, I'll go too far down that spiral, but like, like you're taken on a journey. Every story is consciousness alteration. When you hear a story, even that little bit I just told there of the black fire and white fire, suddenly people are like traveling into the imaginal, right? Consciousness alteration is everywhere. Song is consciousness alteration, right? Art is consciousness alteration. So singing our way back, dancing our way back, arting our way back, you know, communally, ecstatically meditating our way back, chanting our way back, um, fasting our way back. These are the tried and true ways that human beings have always done it. Yeah, we have always had these means of finding our way back to that primordial flow. And the tools, the means, the mechanisms, the instruments is a better word than mechanisms. Now I'm conscious of not using language that's too blocky, right? Instruments of finding our way to that flow are what they've always been. The breath, the pranayama, right? The breath in the yogic traditions. I mean, the breath is such a powerful one, and it's right there and it's immediate. And the ancient yogic texts say, right, where the breath goes, the consciousness follows. The consciousness follows the breath. So if you're really taking deep, slow, profound breaths, it's very difficult to be in a state of agitation, right? And if you're taking really jagged, shallow breaths, it's very difficult to be calm, right? The consciousness follows the breath. The tantric traditions in India, they recognized all this, and that's why there is work across the entire spectrum of somatic human capability. The tantric traditions harness the breath and the movement and the chant and the hum and the song and the artistic image, the pattern, the design, all of these are ways of reconnection, means of reconnection. Tending fire in a circle is a means of reconnection, right? Having a song circle is a means of reconnection. All of these are ways of reconnecting. And what I've seen in, the growth of like the podcasts that I do over the past few years shows me that people are longing for reconnection. They're longing in a world where their attention is being pulled in 1,000 different ways, and the online space has just gotten crazier and crazier and more fragmented. They're longing for simple practices of reconnection. So there are dozens of them, and we don't have to reinvent them. And for the vast majority of them, they're not culturally owned in the sense that, there's nothing culturally specific about singing our way back to remembrance or dancing our way back to remembrance. This is available to everybody, right? Now, obviously, there are certain songs that are held by cultures as, precious and held by that culture alone, and that is always to be respected. But within that, like, there is nothing appropriative about modern people seeking means of spiritual reconnection, seeking means of remembrance and reconnection, seeking songs of reconnection and dances of reconnection and artistic expressions of reconnection and rituals of reconnection and honoring the four directions as a means of reconnection, which has been done in culture upon culture upon culture for thousands of years. All of these are available to us. Really, I mean, the heart of the course that I teach, it's a year-long course, and it's about this. It's about what are these means of reconnection, basically. Um, so, this is inherently what it means to be human. Humans need these practices of reconnection, and they're there, and they're simple, and a big part of it is finding the time and space to do it, and people to do the practices with. You know, it's yeah, I mean, it's right at the heart of what it means to be a human being. So there's some thoughts on that, and um, you know, that reconnection is like the most beautiful thing there is when we feel that place of reconnection. And the separation from it is part of the dance too. Sometimes the separation gets vilified, like, oh, well, I'm feeling separate from source, and I need to find my way back to source. Well, sometimes part of the way we find our way back, quote unquote, to source is by singing of separation, singing about how lonely we feel today, or singing about, what in Brazil is called the saudades. Yeah, like that bittersweet sense of separation. That's a big part of the process too. It's present in so many of the devotional traditions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Annie.
Thank you, Josh, for your words. I have a question about guardianship. I was deeply impacted by your episode of guardianship. I really loved it. And I'd love to hear more about intuition. How do you personally cultivate and refine intuition? And how do you stay in connection with guardians over time? In particularly, how can we open and strengthen these channels so that we can work with them in a collective way, like cooperating with the architectures of nature you speak about, and how we how we can connect with them and work together with them.
Yeah, thank you. I'll say a few things from my own experience. Part of the problem that I think we run into in the modern individualist world is that everything kind of gets thought of as a thing that lives within us that we have to like optimize. And so like intuition, or even like creative inspiration, right, as some kind of like property that we own, it's like my Josh Schrei's intuition, right? And when we see systems and mandalas as much more of a flow between, as a dialogue between, as a web, as a pluriverse, to use the word, right? When we understand it that way, it changes the picture a little bit. So, you know, um, when I feel that the inner monologue or inner dialogue is getting a little bit too frenetic, right? Anyone ever feel that way? Like, the inner popcorn maker is making a little too much popcorn, right? Then rather than try to kind of talk myself into a deeper state, I pay attention to the voices that I'm actually listening to. And I might go into the woods if I can and sit by a stream and listen to the voice of the water for a while. And the voice of the water, right, through its vibrations and undulations, the voice of the water, the song of the water might start to clear out some of that internal muck, and I can then attune more deeply to what you could call the voice of the world. And so the voice of intuition is not necessarily like, mine. It's an attunement to a voice of the world that is always speaking. That voice of the world is always speaking. The world is alive with voice, right? The vegetative life, um, the ancient canyons, the ancient waterways, where I live, the clouds move a lot. There's a lot of movement of the clouds, right? That voice of the world is always speaking. And so I do my best to get out of the way so that I can hear the voice of the world a little bit more deeply and attune to the voice of the world a little bit more deeply. And, we can look to ancient practices around this, in which people in many traditions went and listened to the voice of the waters, listened to the voice of the ocean or the voice of the stream. And people don't always have access to streams or oceans, right? The breeze blows everywhere. Where I live, the traditional culture here named dozens of different voices of the wind that appear on this particular side of the island. And so as we familiarize ourselves with land, as we familiarize ourselves with and land doesn't have to be rural, it can be urban too. But as we really deeply familiarize ourselves with the mandala that surrounds us, and build a relationship with the voices that emanate from what is around us, like intuition for me is a process of, it's like what Bioakomalafe might call like a geographic or geologic process rather than a strictly individual process. Um, you know, the, and then the voice that we receive, and I don't know if I did a couple of episodes called For the Intuitives that speak to this. Um, you know, in modern culture, the intuitive is cast out and the intuitive voice is not recognized as the driving force of culture that it's always been. And so you get people who, and I know this in my own family. I have great grandmothers and great great grandmothers who were committed to mental hospitals because they heard things. And, there's been a very deep and deliberate pushing aside of the intuitive voice. So now we have, which has always been a central driving force of culture. Intuition has always lived right at the heart of culture. It's always lived right at the heart of how people navigate. Communication with the spirit world, communication with the dead, communication with the forces of nature. This has always lived right at the heart of how human beings navigate reality. And when you push it to the side, now in the modern world, we have a lot of people who have sensitivities and have capacities and capabilities, but because they never get recognized or never get anchored in any type of contextual community, are vilified or thought strange, or, or, they kind of get into some really unanchored stuff and proclaim themselves as visionaries and develop cult followings on the internet and all this kind of stuff, right? It's unmoored, it's unanchored. So to start to bring a little more anchor to the visions means that community of discernment that I was talking about earlier. Having a community of discernment, which is also a really big guardianship. It's a big guardianship to have a community of discernment so that my quote unquote visions aren't just my isolated random ideologies that I can either, ignore, reject, or think are the be all end all of everything. They live anchored in a context, in a community. And this is part of the role of that I feel that artistic community should play. Artistic community, um, I think about traditional artistic communities like my friend Rose from Santa Clara Pueblo is in, and it's not just oh yeah, whatever comes through you is totally great. It's no, there's discernment there too. There's discernment around what patterns are going to have positive impact on the community, and what are like kind of maybe things you want to stay away from getting into, and that discernment is important. So recognizing discernment as or intuition as the voice of nature, the voice of the natural world, and then seeking to empty ourselves and cultivate means of listening more deeply, really listening more deeply. And there are lots of practices that I can, point you to when it comes to listening more deeply. Hi. And, and then having a system in which that lives, in which that lives. That in and of itself is a guardianship. And with your larger question about guardianship, first of all, understanding that guardianship is important, understanding that boundary is important, understanding that like there is a reason when ritual space is established, there is boundary to it, and often there is invocation that involves like some forces are welcome here and some we ask you to remain outside, and that there is discernment that the human being isn't just porous, but the human being needs to have boundary too. The human being doesn't just say yes to everything and is open to everything. You know, we have kind of an idealization of being open to everything in the modern world. I want to be more open to everything. Well, in a lot of traditional systems, you put some boundary there. You housekeep this spirit system here. And it's literally called housekeeping in some traditions. You keep the house, and you're clear about how much time you spend doom scrolling and how much time you spend you know, things that could take you into these vortexes that ultimately won't be helpful in your life, that ultimately will lead you down roads of anxiousness and despair, right? Yes, we need people who are paying attention. We don't need to magnify anxiousness and despair in this world, right? Isolation, anxiousness, right? So like the the guardianship starts with the recognition that guardianship is important. If people don't have a recognition that guardianship is important, then it's and for those who are interested in animism, this is animism 101. I mean, animism, so much of traditional animism is about, you know, that housekeeping, that how do I navigate a forest? I mean, you think of the animism of the Amazon basin. How do I navigate a forest that is full of creatures that could kill me in a second? Seriously, people I don't know how many people here have spent time in the Amazon. I've spent a little time in the Amazon. And people have this kind of romantic idea, oh, animism means getting back in touch with the forest. And it's oh yeah, let's talk about the forest. Let's talk about the forest. The forest
Yeah.
isn't just um, all peace and love. The forest is a like, So I'll just say one quick thing because I know you want to move on to more questions, but um, you know, having a consistency of practice in which, whether it's something as simple as a four directions practice or a gratitude practice, or one particular being or entity or deity that we feel an affinity with, or just a simple practice of offering food to the animate forces or saying some words of gratitude aloud. Whatever that simple practice is, what brings the guardianship is doing it over and over and over and over again till the point that you're building like a real relationship foundation. Yeah. And that's like right at the heart of it. It's like, if I'm if there's not a relationship established, then there's not a pattern. And the way that you counteract potentially disruptive patterns is with um, harmonious patterns. And again, the Shipibo have a lot to say about this, right? The harmonious patterns, when we do a practice over and over and over again, then it becomes a rhythmic pattern that counteracts some of the frenetic rhythms that we're exposed to in the world these days. Yeah. So a few thoughts of what could be, again, a very lengthy discussion. I like these big questions, though. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Josh, that in our previous interspecies activation, we went to the Amazon forest, and there are many stories to tell about that. But I'm not going to take more time because we have now very little time left. So, Sen, over to you.
Hi. I want to go back to the beginning of the talk because one thing you mentioned about the nature of the current internet that we have made me remember that the beginnings and the origins of the internet had another ethos. It had a very generative ethos, collective ethos, etc. And I think that sometimes we forget, like we currently forget that that ethos had been captured by other ethos. So that makes me wonder in your practice, what type of like regenerative practice do you explore to use the internet in a regenerative way? Um, or if you see it in other communities of practice, discernment communities, what type of regenerative uses have you explored or have you seen? And I would also love to listen a little bit more about the deep listening practices that you just mentioned that you could share with us. And finally, I would like to mention that I think that one element that hasn't been mentioned yet regarding discernment communities is plurality, because I mean, we can have discernment communities all white or all Christian and actually part of the problem with the internet right now, it's like bubbles and stuff. So also I would just like to put that into the table.
Yeah, I think a plurality of voices in our discernment communities is absolutely vital. Yeah, 100%. So thank you for bringing that. And when I talk about discernment communities, a community to me, a community is not really a community if it's all people who see things exactly the same way. Like, that's not a community. And if you actually have spent time in like an intentional community, and like, the thing that is the most challenging about community, and therefore the best at getting us to that kind of friction of discernment, the thing that is most challenging is that people don't see things the same way, and people do come from a variety of perspectives, and that's deeply challenging and it's deeply necessary, and it's not really a community unless you have that. It's like, and people can pretend they're that way, but even within supposedly aligned systems or subcultures, like people don't see things the same way. Like, you know, um, you know, you can join a like kind of hippie intentional community where people are supposedly all kind of aligned on how to see things and do things. And you will find out very quickly that people actually don't see things the same way at all. And you got to navigate that. And yeah, so within discernment community, I mean the pluriverse and the plurality of voices. And yeah, the ethos of the internet, it gets back to our discussion. I'm going to use the A word again, but it gets back to our discussion on architecture, because an ethos is only as good as its actual embodied architecture. And what was interesting about, I mean, I'm old enough I was in my 20s at the time of Internet 1.0 and the rise. I lived in San Francisco right when it was arriving. And there was this great sense of you know, interconnectivity and opening, right? And interconnectivity and opening are necessary energetics. They're part of the wave of being. They're part of the pulse of any healthy system has to open and interweave and open and interweave and open and interweave. Well, and it was also the time of, tearing down the barriers of through trade agreements like NAFTA, and opening up these boundaries, and really opening up what is now called the free market, right? Well, it turns out that emphasis on the opening part of the cycle isn't enough in and of itself. That there also then has to be boundary. There has to be boundary around that. There are certain creatures of the forest that I don't want my kids to have immediate access to, right? There are ideological whirlpools. It's oh yeah, I'd love to have a bigger audience. The internet's great. I would love to have a bigger audience, So understanding that the ethos of interconnectivity needs to be balanced with the ethos of boundary. This translates into so many areas of modern discourse. The ethos of, let's expand the network, expand the web, also needs to be balanced with the ethos of distinction and boundary. Or you don't get, or you get what you have now, which is you know, there are dangerous voices that are deeply amplified. There are there are funnels and silos that people get dragged in to that never would have been available to them if everything weren't available to everyone all the time, right? So how do we bring that ethos of interconnectivity and find also appropriate boundary around it? I have a feeling we are going to enter a time period where there is going to be limitation placed, for example, on young people's access to social media, because it is becoming recognized what a profoundly disruptive force that is. You can keep the ethos of wanting this greater communication and connectivity, but you can also have limitation and boundary, and these two things aren't exclusive. And understanding that whole systems have both, understanding that trees have both, that trees sometimes have some really thick, thorny bark in order to keep certain things out, or they keep a certain pH balance to drive off certain pests and stuff like this. This is understanding natural systems. Natural systems aren't just interconnectivity with no boundary. Natural systems are interconnectivity with boundary. So I think that's important in our kind of future imagining of the internet. And in the AI episode that I did, I talked a little bit about if we recognize this as sorcerer stuff, if we recognize what I can access through the internet, this is deeply magical, deeply powerful stuff. If we recognize it as that, how does that change our interaction with it and attitude towards it? If you have something that is luminous and sonic and plays on the basic parts of the brain that crave and long and want, but also has this tremendous power to bring people into states of connectivity. Well, it sounds a lot like a drug, actually, right? But if you recognize that you have this incredibly powerful thing, well, what's our protocol around powerful things? Again, our protocol in the West has tended to be as much as possible, as fast as possible, more. And that can be true whether you're talking about, the next step in AI technology, or you're talking about, you know, like trade agreements or whatever you're talking about. We've tended to have this very short-term, impulsive, more is better, faster the better. And it's worth asking ourselves, what are boundaries and constraints around really powerful things? For me in my life, it's interesting because the Emerald podcast was born out of many years of really not being very online. And because I chose an online medium, now I'm online a lot more. And now I'm having to put up boundary. I put up a fair amount of boundary around the amount of Zoom time that I will do. I seek to find ways in the courses I teach to, still establish what you could call like energetic space, mythic space between on calls and between call participants, and it actually works. It actually is quite remarkable how we can slip into animate space together and mythic space together, as I'm sure you all have found in this course too. And so recognizing it as an extremely powerful vehicle of magic helps me understand that it needs to be treated carefully and wisely. And, you know, there are aspects like if I know, for example, that ChatGPT, I learned the hard way that ChatGPT is extremely misleading as a research tool, and you have to really ask it over and over again. Well, if you have some boundaries and protocols and restraints, then it can actually be very helpful if you're doing something like, in-depth, exhaustive research. But you have to have protocols around how you do that, or you get just drawn into this illusory, factless, it's going to tell you what you want to hear kind of thing. So, like with anything powerful, having ritual, ceremony, protocol, and boundary around how you interact with it, I think is important. Yeah. And within that, you were asking about the deep listening practices. Well, there are many, and there's a whole section of the course I teach that goes really deeply into them. It's hard to get into them without actually doing them, and we don't have time to do them now. But there's many that have been handed to me from both the nature tracking traditions that I've studied in, to the Tibetan tantric traditions that I've studied in, to many of the teachers I've studied with have their own versions of how to open up what you could call deeper sense faculties and listen a little bit more deeply. And the first foundational thing, kind of, like I was saying with guardianship practice, the first foundational thing is, first of all, to recognize that the instrument of the human being is often cluttered and needs to be cleared or emptied so that we can listen a little bit deeper. And then even if in that recognition, like taking a few breaths to be like, oh, okay, recognizing the churning patterns that get underway in any given day in our heads, right? And recognizing that those are things that we can simply allow to dissolve and slip away, and we can hollow out, and we can use the breath as a way to hollow out and empty. And we can step across a threshold of consciousness wherein we're in a different state of consciousness. We're in fairy tale time or mythic time. We're in a place of flow a little bit more deeply. Recognizing that that place exists and knowing we can get to that place. And then in that place, in this place, we can go there together. We can let some of the even the conversational residue from today and all of the crystallizations of patterns around thought forms, around everything that the conversation provoked, we can let that dissolve, and we can let it melt, and we can exhale it out. And anything that's been bothering us, or anything that on our to-do list that's nagging at us, we can let that melt away a little bit. And we can step across a threshold. into what you could call mythic space, mythic time. The time that human beings have recognized for so long in so many ways that we need to step into. And then here in this space, it's kind of like a womb space, a space of nascence, meaning things are still in their potentiality. Thoughts aren't formed yet. It's just steeping in its own being. Here in this space where we're not seeking to go here or there or do this or that, here in this space, we can open up our ears to listen. And then we understand that listening happens through the whole body. That we listen through the scalp, the skin, the hair, the tongue. We listen through the soles of the feet. We listen through the bone marrow. And then we feel that the air around us is not void, it's not empty. It's fluid, it's teeming with life. And that life has voice. And we can listen to it more deeply. Yeah, this is very simple listening. And then there's, it goes on from there. But that's the heart of it is empty out the instrument and connect to that deeper place of listening. Yeah.
May Josh and everybody, may we continue to recognize each other in that space, regardless of the form we take. And may we take that nascent into this reweaving of a new pattern that we are all deeply engaged with. Because I think that's what brought us here together. And opening with gratitude and closing with gratitude is always very important for us. So thank you, Josh. And also thank you, each and every one of you, those of you who are here in this Zoom call, those who have been listening through YouTube, also those of you who will listen through in an apparent different time that is this same time that the magic of the internet allows. Thank you for being right here, right now, engaged in the active magic of reweaving the patterns, the endless act of reweaving. It really is an honor, Josh. Thank you so much. We've learned so much. We always learn so much from you, always. And I truly hope that this will be just the first thread of our weaving together, because yes, I suppose listening to the intuition of listening to the Emerald podcast is a good thing to, is a good seed to plant. And knowing that we are in it together is always very heartening. Yeah. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for
please.
having me. I just want to say gratitude for having me. And yeah, I learn much in spaces like this. And I always like to give thanks to the mysterious source at the heart of it all, to the animate force that moves through all this.
Yes. Thank you to that force too. And maybe if it's okay, with full compassion for this world where we are very tired of cameras, but if you feel like it, maybe just to wave goodbye, if you can turn on your video, it would be beautiful in a gesture of gratitude. Thank you so much. It's been beautiful to share this time with you. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Josh. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Josh.
Muchas gracias a todos.